The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, and welcome to HDSA's Caregivers Corner webinar series. Today, I am pleased to welcome Hope Heller, who is going to discuss advanced planning for HD from a social work perspective. Before I invite Hope to begin, I'm going to go over how to ask a question as well as how to access this webinar and other HDSA webinars after broadcast. All questions will be answered following Hope's prepared presentation, but you can send your question at any point. To send a question, just go to your control panel that you see on the right-hand side of your screen. In the questions pane, type in your question and hit send. And again, Hope will be answering questions after her presentation. This webinar will also be available for viewing approximately 1 week after broadcast on the HDSA National website. To access the presentation, just go to www.hdsa.org/C as in caregiver corner. And you will, on this section of the website, you'll be able to view this webinar recording and download a copy of the presentation, as well as view and download all of our previous Caregivers Corner webinars. You can also find HDSA's Lunch and Learn series at hdsa.org/LL. And now I'm very pleased to turn the floor over to Hope Heller. Hope has been the HDSA chapter social worker for the Washington, D.C. Metro chapter since 2010. She facilitates several HDSA support groups and provides individual resources and education for HD families. Hope is also actively involved in HDSA advocacy, and most recently she was hired to be the program coordinator and social worker for the new HD Center at Georgetown University.
Hi everybody, I'm Hope. So today I'm going to be talking to you about advanced planning from the social work perspective and talking about advanced directives most specifically. So the first question is, what is an advanced directive? So an advanced directive it's a legal document that allows you to make your wishes for the end-of-life care known to the doctors so that they can act on your best behalf. You may hear advanced directives referred to other things, sometimes called living wills, sometimes they're called the directives to physicians. And then sometimes they are confused with things like power of attorney documents, healthcare agents, durable power of attorney. So they're all documents that work together, but there are distinct differences. There was a previous webinar by Charlotte Irwin, who's an attorney, who had gone a little bit more into the legal pieces of that. So at the end of this, I will give you a link if you want to go into the more legal detail of that. But essentially, an advanced directive is just a document that allows you to make your health care wishes known and also to appoint somebody to help in the event that you are unable to make those decisions for yourself. So who should have an advanced directive? Everyone should have it. Regardless of whether they have Huntington's disease or not, everybody should have an advanced directive. The reality is we aren't going to live forever, despite what we all like to think. And it doesn't matter what age you are or how healthy you seem. Life can change in a minute, and these advanced directives are there to make sure that when the unexpected happens, our wishes and our values are known to our doctors and to the people that we love that we're asking to make these decisions. Again, as I said, there are many different terms and phrases that you'll hear asked. Sometimes it depends on what state you're in. Every state may have a little different name of what they call the advanced directive or the healthcare directive. interchangeably, but I did want to point out two very different meanings and two different things that are not the same person. So there's we've heard the term power of attorney and we've heard the term guardian. A power of attorney is somebody that you appoint yourself when you are of sound or decisions for you. They are the person that you sign off and say, this is who I want to make my decisions in the event that I am unable to make my decisions. A guardian functions in many of the same ways as a power of attorney, but a guardian is somebody that's court appointed. So if you reach a point in which you are unable to make decisions for yourself, this is somebody that the court will have step in to make those decisions. A power of attorney has a lot more freedom to make decisions depending on the state without answering to anybody. A guardian, again, depending on state law, has to run decisions through a judge or through a court system. So then the question is, you know, I've told you everyone should have one, but why should you have an advance directive? And it's very simple. Do you want to make your own decisions about your life, or do you want someone else to? Personally, I'm a control freak, so I don't want anybody else making my life and death decisions for me. And that's just it. Advance directives, they're talking about your end-of-life care. They're talking about what interventions you do or you don't want, how aggressive you want doctors and physicians to be at the end of your life. So the advance directive allows you to make that decision. And it allows you to make that decision before you're put on the spot and have to make that decision in a moment. So it gives you the chance to say, this is what I want, this is what my values are. And it also gives you the opportunity to say, and if there are more decisions to be made, this is the person that I trust to make those decisions. And this is the person that I know is going to act in my best interest based on my values. The other thing I say is it's really a gift to your family and your loved ones, because they're tough decisions to make, and when there's not an advance directive in place or when wishes aren't known, it's often a time of crisis that a family is put in a room with a doctor and the doctor says, these are your options. What do you think this person would want? And these loved ones have to make the best decision that they can make in that time. And it's really a gift for them to be able to say that, you know, this person had an advance directive and this is what they wanted, so I know that this is the right thing to do. So it's really something you can give to them. The other thing is that if you don't appoint the healthcare agent, state law and the courts really determine who makes those life and death decisions for you. Once you aren't able to make those decisions, it's out of your control. And the state doesn't say, well, we know you liked this person best, or, you know, we know that this was the closest person to you, so we're going to let them make the decision. State law really dictates the hierarchy of who makes the decision. And just to give you a couple of examples of how advance directives have worked really well in other opportunities where it would have been nice to have one. I used to work in a neuroscience ICU, and I had a gentleman that had a stroke. And again, like I said, this isn't just about Huntington's disease. This gentleman came in and he had a stroke, and he was hooked up to a ventilator that was keeping him alive. And there was a family that was by his bedside for a week, and they were there every moment. And when it came time to make the decision whether the machine should be turned off or what should be done, it came out that that family was not his legal family. It was a girlfriend that he had for more than 10 years, which in some states would have been enough. But this gentleman also had a wife that he hadn't seen in 20 years. And because they were still legally married, he was the legal decision maker. And we did have to bring in another person that legally he was married to that he hadn't seen in 20 years. And she was ultimately the person that made the decision to turn off those machines. So that's not, so you have to ask yourself, do you want to risk that there may be somebody that you haven't seen in a very long time that the courts or the states would recognize as your decision maker, or do you want it to be that person that spent the week by your bedside? And I'll show you, an example of when advanced directives can work very well and be very beneficial is I had a gentleman whose wife had Huntington's disease, and they were planners, and they had the conversation about feeding tubes and if she wanted one, and she was very clear that she didn't want one. And that day came that he had to decide not to place a feeding tube. And after she had passed away, he had said it was much harder than I anticipated to watch her, pass and not just ask for the feeding tube and provide the nutrition. But I had the peace of mind because we had talked about it, and I had the advanced directive, and I knew that it's what she wanted. So for him, it was really that peace of mind that he was able to give her what she wanted. Because when it comes to the end of life, sometimes it does seem cruel and hard to say, I'm not going to provide this treatment that may or may not help, or, I'm going to withhold nutrition, or because we're not doing that. We're honoring somebody's wishes. And that's important to dictate that. It's important to dictate, do you want the feeding tube? Do you not want a feeding tube? How much pain medication do you want? These are all things that the advanced directive allows you to say. So I talked about that worst case scenario. So in that example I gave you before, it was an urgent situation, so we didn't go to court. We had to make a very quick decision based on the laws as to who was the legal decision maker. Now, in a lot of cases, that's not what happens. We end up in court trying to appoint a guardian. Again, this is a court-appointed person. So a judge that doesn't know you and doesn't know your family looks at the list of options and says, based on this, I think this person should make the decision. It's an expensive process. It can be a difficult process, and it can also be a long process. When there's no conflict whatsoever, I've seen it take 8 weeks to get a court date. So it takes 8 weeks to get a court date. That's if there's no conflict, you may get a guardian on that day. And every state and every jurisdiction is going to vary, whether they can get you in 2 weeks or 2 months, or but if there's conflict, it can take a lot. So, and if you have 4 family members that all seem to want to do this, and they all have different values and different opinions as to what they can think, it can draw this process out for a very long time. The other piece with that is that in a medical emergency, state law will dictate who makes that decision if we don't have time to wait for a court to make a decision. But financial assets, bank accounts, things like that are unavailable during this time if there's not somebody else listed on that bank account. If there's not somebody else that's been appointed, then that person who's no longer able to make the decisions for themselves, their bills may be going unpaid. Their mortgage may not be paid. Their rent may not be paid. Their electricity bill may not be paid. Their health insurance bills may not be paid. Because again, there wasn't a power of attorney appointed, so there's no access to the funds. So this is all held up while we're in court fighting this out or working this out. And ultimately, at the end of the day, it's that patient or that person that's suffering, because they're waiting for the courts to decide who's going to make their decisions. So they could be stuck in a hospital. They could be stuck in a nursing home. They could be stuck in limbo waiting to see what their next course of treatment is going to be. So really, guardianship is not the ideal situation, because it means that we've already had an event that has caused us to need to go to court, and now we're in limbo waiting for somebody totally outside of the situation to make a decision. The other piece with that is oftentimes papers have to be served and things like that. So if you have a loved one that is living in a house and is unable to make their decisions, and you're going to right, for guardianship, so you can help them get care and move them to assisted living or something like that, the court is going to show up at their home in some states and serve them with paperwork, which can be terrifying. I think in any case, if somebody shows up and gives you paperwork, it's a very scary process. So that's a little bit what happens with guardianship. So it's not an ideal situation. So one of the other pieces with an advance directive is it allows you to really talk about the quality of life. And these are conversations to have. Everybody has a different definition of the quality of life. For some people, they're very firm in that if they cannot still walk and talk and do things independently, then they don't consider they have a quality of life that's with aggressive measures. For other people, they're happy if they can sit in the room with their family, and even if they can't participate, they're aware of what's going on. The biggest one, I think, is the right to, the ability to eat and enjoy food. For some people, that's a big indicator of the quality of life. And that's sort of where you come into the idea of, you know, feeding tubes are something to talk about in advance. So with feeding tubes, there are lots of questions to be asked, and there are lots of things to address in an advance directive with them. So every feeding tube has a goal. What's the goal of the feeding tube? Is the goal simply to prolong life, and there's not an opportunity that there's going to be improved quality of life? Or in cases, is there a benefit to it? In some cases, there is a great benefit to a feeding tube. If somebody has had issues swallowing and they've been sick and their illness has weakened them, sometimes short-term a feeding tube can give you the extra nutrition and that extra, you know, jolt that you need to get a little bit stronger to get better. And the feeding tube may be considered to be temporary. So in some cases, that feeding tube may be beneficial. In a lot of cases, unfortunately, the feeding tube is just a way to essentially prolong life. So that's something to talk about, is if you, under what circumstances would you or wouldn't you want a feeding tube? It's not a black and white answer, so it's something to talk about that, you know, when would you consider one or when wouldn't you consider one? And feeding tubes are often one of those forgotten items. You know, oftentimes when we think about advance directives, we think about things like life support or ventilator care or do not resuscitate orders, and we want to talk about that, or we want to talk about pain management at the end of life. Those are things that oftentimes we think about when talking about an advance directive, and we forget that a feeding tube is one of those items that's actually one of the harder decisions to make it sometimes, because it's not as clear cut, or it's not, you know, there are different reasons and uses. So feeding tubes are something that you want to talk about when you want to talk about the quality of life, because again, that goes back to, is somebody's quality of life them being able to eat food and enjoy food. I'll give you an example. My uncle, and this was just about a week and a half ago, we had to make the decision with him to put in a feeding tube or not to put in a feeding tube, and thankfully he was still able to be a part of that conversation and still make his own decisions. And for him it was very clear, is he was willing to try a temporary one to see if it made him stronger, but that he did not want a permanent feeding tube because he wanted his morning coffee, and he wanted his coffee cake, and he wanted his bagels. And if he couldn't have that, that really limited his quality. So that was a conversation that we were still able to have with him, and we were lucky to be able to have that conversation with him. But it's a very hard decision to make. So it's one of those things, again, you want to talk about your values and your qualities, because even within a married couple, one spouse may have a different definition of quality of life. So then the question is, once you've started talking about all these tough decisions about life and where you're going to go with these tough decisions, how do you choose the person that's going to make these decisions when you're no longer able to? or that's going to put your advanced directive into play. So a very wise social worker had said to me that it should be the person with the clearest head in the worst possible time. So if you can see into the future and you see that you have 4 siblings and 4 children and a spouse all in a room, frantic and arguing, who in that room stands out to you as the one that's going to tell everybody to be quiet and be able to say, you know what, this is what they would want. This is what she wants. This is not about what we want, but this is about what she wants. Because it's very hard. When we're talking about life and death, emotion really comes into play. No one wants to say, let's turn off the life support. No one wants to say, let's not give them a feeding tube. Those are very tough decisions. You don't want to be perceived as the one that has somehow made the decision that it's okay to end things, because that's not what you're doing. You're carrying out someone's wishes and values when you make tough decisions like that. So you need a person that is able to have a clear head and understand that understands, I am making this decision because this is what they would want me to do. So it's important to know that when you choose a person, that it's got to be someone that you know will be able to do that. Again, you've got to know that they've got to put, that it's somebody that can maybe put their emotions aside and think about what you would want. And sometimes it's not an obvious person. Oftentimes you think, well, I'm married, so my husband or my wife should be my decision maker. But ask yourself if you don't want extraordinary measures past a certain point, is your spouse going to have the strength to say goodbye or to turn down extraordinary measures because it's not what you want? Sometimes your spouses can, but you have to know, is that the person? So again, it's important to know it's not always the obvious person. But again, when you make that decision, if you're not choosing the obvious person, those are conversations to have with people about it. This is why I've chosen this person. But again, keep an open mind when you make that decision. So now that we've established why we need an advanced directive and why they're good and the importance of them, the question is, how do you have that conversation with your loved one, with your brother, your sister, your child, your parents, or your spouse? So how do you have that conversation? Because I'll tell you something, it's always going to be an uncomfortable conversation. Anytime that you say, hey, let's talk about the end of life. Let's talk about when we get to this point. No one wants to think about that, quite honestly. People aren't often thinking to themselves, you know, great, let me tell you what happens when I reach the end. So the important thing is that it should be a family discussion. You know, if you're going to your husband or your wife and you're saying, honey, you need an advanced directive, and my question back to you is, do you have an advanced directive? Because if you're asking your spouse to have those tough decisions, have those tough discussions and make those tough decisions, you should be having those also about yourself. Again, everybody needs an advanced directive. This is not something that's Huntington specific. So make it a family discussion. Hey, honey, you know what? I realize we don't have advanced directives. Let's sit down and let's do this. Oftentimes, people will have planning parties and advanced directive parties, and you can all sit around the table and have a bottle of wine or not. Don't have too much wine when making these decisions, but you know, have some fun with it. All talk about it. Talk about what you want. Don't let it be something that you're telling the other person that they have to do. This isn't punitive. This is something that you're doing for yourself and for them. It also needs to be a safe environment when you do this. So we talked about people's definition of the quality of life can be different. And until you have these discussions, you may not realize that your loved one's values or quality of life differ from yours. So be prepared for for answers that you weren't ready to hear, and try to keep the judgment out of it. Because the reason you're doing the advanced directive is so that this person can make a decision about themselves. So there is no right or wrong answer when doing this. So it's important to remember that. If your loved one says something that's hard for you to hear, when doing this, you have to remember that this is their decision and you have to let them have that decision. So be prepared for that. That goes back to also when choosing the agent. Not always the obvious person. So if you're talking to your husband or wife and asking them to do an advanced directive, and they say, you know what, I really think our son Jimmy should be my agent, then be prepared for that. And again, let it be a safe environment. Again, it's a sensitive topic. Sometimes it's hard to walk through the front door and be like, hey, honey, tonight we should do advanced directives. So sometimes it's helpful to relate it to something that a person enjoys. For example, if you know the person you want to talk to about advanced directives is a movie buff, maybe mention a movie where you know end of life came into play, or if they like to read the newspaper or watch the news every day, maybe find an article about it. And then when you start discussing it, say, you know, we should talk about this. We haven't talked about this for ourselves. And let it flow into the conversation like that. Here's the thing. If you're having a conversation with someone, chances are you know them pretty well. They're somebody you love. They're your family. So you know them. Find out how this is going to be the easiest to bring it into conversation. The reality is it's not an easy conversation. So there is going to be some challenge sometimes in bringing this up. So think about the easiest way to soften that conversation. And then go from there. Engage it. As the conversation continues to flow, you know when to press them for more information, or know when to take what you can get from it. Sometimes it takes baby steps. Sometimes it's enough for them to say in the first conversation, well, I don't want to talk about the rest of it, but I know that I want you, or I want someone else to be the person that makes those decisions. That's okay. That's a step forward. Drop them down and go from there. Again, it's a conversation that it is great when you can all sit down and you can do it at once and be done with it. But it's a conversation that can be an ongoing conversation. So if you have gotten them to agree to have the conversation, or you are ready to sit down and have the conversation, then the question goes, where do you start? So the first place that you can start is, if you're not sure about websites and things like that, is the HCSA helpline. So you can call HCSA and we can point you in the right direction. We can get you forms and things that you need. The other option is, like I said, every state has different laws and different rules, but most hospitals have some type of form advanced directive that's based on their state regulations. So it's always helpful to call up your local hospital and say, I'd like to do an advanced directive. Do you have a form that you can send me? Do you have a form that you can point me in the direction to? Hospitals like this. Hospitals are happy to help. Honestly, it makes a hospital's job easier when a patient comes in with a filled out advanced directive. I would usually start with the social service or case management department of the hospital. So you could call your local hospital, call the main number, say I'd like to speak to the case management office or the social work office, and they can point you in the direction of your advanced directive. The important thing to remember with that is these are state specific, so if you move state, you may need to update your advanced directive. And then again, there are lots of resources online that exist. Caringinfo.org is a website that has all of state-specific advanced directives. They have different information and things like that for how to plan, where to go from there. So this is a good site to use. The American Bar Association also has a toolkit that people can use in order to help the plan, and also has some of the documents available. And again, then there's the 5 wishes. 5 wishes is a form document. It is used in all states. It's not honored in all states, so you'll want to look specifically at the state. But again, and all of these form advance directives, and they'll lay out for you what are the questions, do you want this under this circumstance? What do you want for this? So these form documents can also help drive the conversation. Because sometimes the question is, well, I don't know where to start. I don't know what we should be thinking about. I don't know what we should be taking into consideration. And these forms help with that. The other thing is you can go to an attorney. And an attorney, an elder law attorney can help draw up all of these documents. That can be expensive for someone without resources. These forms are all free. I'm not sure if most of these forms are free and available online, so that is an option. Again, it would be state-specific laws, but in some states, for just the medical power of attorney and advance directives, it doesn't require a notary. It just requires witnesses. Again, you'll need to look at your specific state for those answers. The other piece of that is for a power of attorney that's going to have financial access. Those in most states do require a notary. So you'll want to look at your state-specific laws. But these sites can give you some of the form letters so that you don't necessarily have to go, take the time to go to an attorney and to do all these papers. And this is helpful because it's less scary sometimes if you can sit down over the dinner table and just talk about what you want and what your wishes are. So I do encourage you to look at those links and go from there. Other helpful links, I had mentioned earlier that Sheila Irwin, who is an attorney, had put together a previous webinar, Preparing for the Unknown. So I do, if you haven't seen her webinar, I do recommend taking a look at it. She goes into a little bit more of the legal piece of it. Because the legal piece is something I could talk about all day, but I'm not a lawyer, so I'll let you look at that. And the other thing is HDSA always has articles and information and continued research. So it's something to continue to look at and to check back on HDSA regularly. And again, the helpline is always a great resource if you can't find what you need on hdsa.org. So now that I've told you how to get started and you've had this conversation, what happens in the likelihood that your loved one will not discuss it or refuses to fill it out? And unfortunately, in Huntington's disease, that's probably something we see because there is a lot of denial and there's a lot of lack of insight to what's going on and what's happening. And you've already been diagnosed and you already know that you have this disease, so why do you have to talk about how it's going to end? So people don't want to discuss it. People don't want to talk about it. So there's still, while it's great to have all of your paperwork in order and have all of those legal documents in place, the important thing about these documents is really so that your wishes are conveyed. The reason we want our loved ones to fill out these forms and to do this is so that we know what they want and we know what their values are. So if you can't get them to fill out an advance directive or to do the paperwork, there's no reason to not try to at least figure out what their values are. Remember we talked about that if there's somebody that's a movie buff or a news article, trying to start that with a conversation. You can always have that as an ongoing conversation. So say you've tried to have that advanced directive discussion and you've tried and you know it's not happening. So the next time there's a piece on the news about something that's happened relating to end-of-life care or feeding tubes, or the next time you're watching a movie or a television show that that presents that. Maybe say, hey, if that were me, I don't think I would want that. Or if that were me, I would agree. I would do that for myself. What would you do? It makes it a two-way conversation. And if you're talking about it over something about the news or pop culture, it takes some of that seriousness out of it that may be what is scaring them. And at the end of the day, it's simply important to know what their wishes are, because if that paperwork's not in place, then you still want to know that you're acting in their best interest. They may be willing to tell you, hey, I know that you're the one I want to make the decisions, or our son Jimmy's the one that I know I want to make decisions. So you go with that. So if you can't get them to the advanced directive, then at least try to continue to have those conversations. So that ultimately, at the end of the day, what we're doing is acting on their behalf, and in their best interest for what they would want for their values. Try to slip in a conversation about values, things like that. Those are ways to at least know what a person wants. So I'm going to turn it over for questions in just a minute, but I just wanted to point out that HCSA has put on this webinar, and part of it is to serve the community and to help with the issues. Questions that people have. So HCSA does want your feedback, so please do complete the survey evaluation you receive, or contact Jean Hogan and tell her what you thought of the webinar today. And then we're also planning to do 2 more webinars regarding advanced planning for Huntington's disease. So tell her what you want to see, because that way we can plan these webinars based on what the community would like. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to turn it over to questions here. And then also my email is up, so please feel free if you want to contact me afterwards with questions. I'm happy to answer any questions. So I'll go ahead, and the panel on the side, you'll be able to type in any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Hope. And just as a reminder to type in, or to ask a question, just type it into your panel and hit the send button. Don't be afraid to ask questions. And also, if you just want to know where to start or what information applies to you, definitely you can call the HDSA helpline, and that's a really great place to start the conversation. And finally, just to echo what Hope said, we are looking for feedback from the community on other topics relating to advanced planning so that we can give as much information as possible. So if there is a topic that you want to see offered, please let us know.
And the other thing I didn't mention is the other person to talk to is your local HCSA social worker. This is what we do with social workers, is we help get these, we tell you where to go, we help you start these conversations. So also don't hesitate to involve your social worker and ask your local social worker for help. So I have the first question. So it says, what happens if we've filled out the advanced directive, but my wife is unable to, no longer has the ability to make the decision before she signed it? So this, I get this a lot. So people will have had the discussion, or they filled out the paperwork, and before it's signed and witnessed, something happens and that person is no longer able to make a decision. So the answer is you can't have them sign it once they are no longer deemed able to make decisions. So unfortunately, that piece has passed. What you can do is, if you have that piece of paper with her wishes, you can use that to guide you. And the same, but it does often happen that I've seen that in a hospital where people say, can we do the advanced directive now? And the answer is always, no, you can't, because they can no longer, the doctor says they're no longer able to make it.
Hope, I have a question for you. What is the most common question that you receive from families? And what are the sort of your top 3 tips that you recommend that people know?
You know, I think one of the biggest questions I get is how late into the progress of a disease can we address it? And oftentimes the person asking me that has sort of missed the opportunity that it is okay. So the reality is that as soon as you think that your loved one is reaching that point where they may not be able to make decisions for themselves, do the advance directive then, if you haven't already done it. Other tips is, you've got all these good resources and forums, so print them out and have them ready when you're about to have that discussion. Because if your loved one is willing to have that discussion right then and there, have the paperwork in front of you. There's no reason to delay having the paperwork. The other thing is, when you have this discussion, maybe already try to think about what your values are. So when you're having those tough discussions, you already know what your feelings for yourself are, so that you're able to, to contribute to that and say, well, this is why I think I want this. And that sometimes helps the other person think about the different reasoning and logic and then go through their own process.
That's great, Hope. Thank you. What would you say to people who may feel that it's not, that they don't know where to start and that they're sort of overwhelmed with it?
That's when I would go back to using your social worker. It's a very overwhelming process. It is, because we're asking you to dig deep and think about your values at their core, and then after we ask you to have these very emotional conversations, we're asking you to make sure that you've legally done paperwork correctly. So that's where it's a good time to use your HDSA social worker, or use the helpline, or employ somebody, or ask somebody else for help, because sometimes that outside party is able to break it down a little bit simpler and work with you without the emotion involved in it, because sometimes you do have to.
Thank you, Hope. So this is the, we do have a little bit more time. If anyone has any other questions, please send them. And just as a reminder that Hope's slides are going to be available, as is this entire presentation, in about 1 week on the HDSA website. If you go to www.hdsa.org/C-corner, you will be able to get those as well as previous webinars. So, Hope, you did such a great job that it sounds like people don't have any questions at this time. I just wanted to remind everybody to please email any questions that you have, or any other topics that you want to hear about with regard to advanced planning, to me or to complete our survey. And if you do find questions, you can always call the HDSA helpline at 888-HDSA-506. or contact Hope directly at heller@hdsa.org. Thank you, Hope, and thank you, everybody who joined us.
Thank you, Jane.